Let's take a look at the inseam pocket sample. You'll need the inseam pocket front garment pattern, cut 1 from muslin. The inseam pocket back garment, also cut 1 from muslin. And the inseam pocket bag. I have an older copy of the pattern. Your copy should say to cut 1 pair from contrast fabric. This contrast fabric can be anything that looks different from your muslin. I'm using my red bandana fabric just to keep it consistent with the rest of the samples that I'm doing. If you're working with, another reason I've used this particular fabric is that it has an easily discernible right and wrong side. So you can clearly see that I have cut a mirrored pair for each of these. Now, if you have a fabric that is not, you can't easily see the right or wrong side, just flip one of them over until you have a mirrored pair. But if you're working with a fabric like this that has a clear right and wrong side, make sure you're cutting these in a mirrored pair and that you don't have 2 of the same piece cut. Make sure you have clipped all of your notches, traced all of your internal stitching lines, and copied all of your tailor's tacks. I'm going to go ahead and do so on my work here. I'm going to use my friction pen to copy all of my marks to the wrong side of my muslin. With my pattern pieces oriented like this is my front, this is my back. I'm going to turn these over so I can see my muslin, and I'm going to copy all of the points where my tailor's tacks are. There should be 3 tailor's tacks on each piece. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and 3. And with those copied, I can remove my pins. And again, I've done really simple, quick, simple tailor's tacks, just gone in and out through my fabric and pattern one time so I can easily take these tailor's tacks out. I'm going to carefully remove my patterns. And you'll notice on our patterns, we've got 3-point darts on back and front. So I'm going to identify those using my tailor's tacks. This is my front, so I'll work with this first. Now I've been marking on the wrong side, so I'm going to flip mine over so I'm marking on the wrong side. And here's my tailor's tack for my dart that goes up into my waistline. So I'm going to find my notches on either side and redraw my waistline dart. So there's one notch. I'm going to line up my ruler against that notch to my tailor's tack. Here's my other notch, lining up my ruler to my tailor's tack. That takes care of my front. I'm going to look to my back. Got to turn this over to the wrong side. So make sure your pattern looks like this. This would be the wrong sides of our patterns for this particular sample. Again, lining up my notch to my tailor's tack. And the other notch to get the other dart leg drawn into place. So that's my front and my back on my wrong sides. Now, I'm going to remove those tailor's tacks from my darts. These 2 other tailor's tacks indicate areas where we have to pivot our stitching. as we work our way around this sample. Generally speaking, when you're working on an inseam pocket like this on a garment, you want to interface these areas where your tailor's tacks are. These points can be a high stress point on these pockets. Now, I'm not requiring you to put interfacing on yours, but I will show you how to go about doing so if you feel like you want to take the added challenge to do so. You should have lightweight or weft fusible interfacing in preparation for future samples. I've got some black weft interfacing here, so you can easily see it on my muslin. Ideally, you would want to use a interfacing similar to the color of your garment, but for sample purposes, I'm going to use black weft interfacing. And I'm going to cut a few small squares of this interfacing. Now, there are multiple ways to interface this. You could cut a long strip that could cover the entire side seam edge on both sides. I'm just going to make 4 little squares to cover our tailor's tacks. That'll be 1 and 2, 3 and 4. 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now, I want to make sure, I've got 4 little squares here. I'm going to leave my tailor's tacks in because I'm going to take these to the iron. Fusible interfacing is called fusible because it has heat activated adhesive on the back. You should feel tiny little bumps on one side of your interfacing. Those are the little dots of fusible heat activated adhesive. And once you place this on an iron, you place the bumpy side of your interfacing down onto the wrong side of your fabric. We don't want interfacing showing on the right side of the fabric. So this goes to the wrong side of your fabric. You hit it with a nice hot iron and your interfacing will be stuck. So I'm going to head to the iron and fuse these very carefully. Remember, you are not required to do this, but I'm showing you if you intend to use this pattern on future garments that this is something you should do, is interface your tailor's tacks. So the wrong side of my samples, here's my front garment piece with my smaller dart, shallower dart. Here's one tailor's tack and the other. I haven't removed the actual tailor's tacks because I don't want to lose those points, especially since I'm about to go over them with an iron. And I'll just place a little piece of interfacing right by this tailor's tack. That's a strange sound. Never heard my iron make that noise before. Hit it with some steam. Let it sit for about 10 seconds. You don't want to move your iron around when you're placing interfacing. It can cause the interfacing to shift out of place. So I'm just going to hold the iron down, hit it with some steam, wait for about 10 seconds. Then lift it off, let it cool, let that adhesive set, let it sink into the fabric and set, and then you should be able to test around the edges to make sure it doesn't lift off easily. And that's now fused into place. I'll do the same up here for this other tailor's tack. I'm just going to make sure that my interfacing doesn't pass over my cut edge. I don't want to have to trim it because I'm lazy. Hit that with some steam. Let it sit for about 10 seconds. Lift my iron off, let it cool. And then I can check around the edges to make sure it doesn't lift up easily for me. Now that I've interfaced those, I can remove my tailor's tacks. It is going to be a little bit tricky removing them because that fusible interfacing is going to hold it in place, but I'm going to do my best to just carefully slide those out So before I do so, I want to mark where my corners are, because now I've covered them with black interfacing. If you were using white interfacing, it'd be a little bit easier to see, but I'm going to redraw my seam lines on here. So you can use white interfacing, you can use no interfacing, totally up to you. I'm going to repeat the same on the back here. Little piece of interfacing. Okay, so I've reinforced those little points. I'll just clean this up a little bit on my workstation. And trim off any little excess of interfacing so I don't have to deal with that. I'm going to use my chalk pencil, just to mark out my 1/2 inch seam allowance so I can see this a little bit better. So it's a little difficult to see, but I have measured a 1/2 inch in from my cut edge here and marked with chalk where my seam line will go. And I can see where these two lines of chalk intersect right in this area. So that's where my tailor's tack was. And I can even poke through it with a pin and you should be able to see it from the opposite side. Should be pretty close to that point. So I did the same down here, again measuring a 1/2 inch in from the raw edge here and here to make my chalk lines so I can see where those 2 points meet, so I know that that is close to my pivot point where my tailor's tack is. There we go. I'll leave my tailor's tacks in. Typically when you are sewing, you tend to leave those in and then remove them afterward. I'm going to do the same on my back garment. I know this is the back of my garment because it has, I'm sorry, this is the front of my garment. This one has the shorter dart, this one has the longer dart. The back of your garments tend to have the longer darts. Okay, just so I know where these 4 points are going to be, and again I'll leave my tailor's tacks in there just in case I need them. The front and back pieces are ready to go. There's my front, there's my back, and I'm going to head to my machine and sew my darts. Now that I have sewn my 2 darts, I've left tails at the end so I can tie my knots. I'll take these to the iron and press them towards the center. Yeah, may as well. This one I don't trust to leave on, but these 2 I think we can leave on. Now, just like our previous samples, this curved side is our side seam, goes to the side of the body, whereas the straighter side of our pattern, that's got a nice straight vertical cut on it, that leads towards the center of our garment. So I'm going to place this is my back piece with the longer dart, side seam out over there, and I'm going to press this dart excess towards that straighter cut edge. Same thing here on my front piece. The curved side that's got the tailor's tacks and whatnot, that's the side seam. So I'm going to press my excess towards the straight side, the straight cut side of my sample. These are pressed. I'll head back to my workstation. Front with the shorter dart, back with the longer dart. I'm going to tie my knots at the end of my darts. Leaving little tails. Just untwisting those tails so I can tie a nice square knot. Trim the tails. So I've taken care of the prep work with my darts. I now want to add the rest of my pockets to my 2 pieces. You'll notice we've got our curved side seams from our patterns. Here are our curved side seams, just like we had on the slash pocket, and just as you'll see on the skirt pattern. With these extra pieces of fabric, these are referred to as outlets, little extra outlets of fabric added on to either side. And our pocket bag pattern attaches to these little outlets. So it creates one continuous pocket shape. Something like this. These will stitch together with a seam, and then we end up with a full pocket bag that we're going to stitch together on the front and the back of our garment. So, this is the right side of my samples. I know because my dart excess is not visible. So right side up. Doesn't matter which one you're using, the left, the front, or the back garment, either will work. I'm going to take the right side of my pocket bag fabric and place that along this raw edge. When we line this up, it can be a little difficult because of the way the seam allowances are cut. Along this top edge here, we want to line up the raw edges. So here's my muslin, here's my fabric again. Right side up, right side down, so right sides together. I want to align my raw edges here and here. And I want this raw edge at the top of my sample, the top is where your dart is, this angle here should blend into the angle of my pocket bag. So this way you'll know this is properly aligned. And I'm going to pin perpendicular to my stitching line because I will stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, making sure everything is lined up here. Yep, as long as this is a smooth transition from one diagonal line to the next. We don't want to set this all the way up here where it kind of offsets. It comes up here. Just lower it just enough. And this doesn't have to be perfect. But as long as there's a smooth transition from one diagonal line to the next, you should be fine. Okay, we'll do the same thing over here. Right side up, can't see my dart excess. Right side down, so right sides together. Lining up my raw edges and making sure there's a smooth transition from one diagonal to the next. Now if I pin it this way, I'll be stitching with all my excess fabric to the right side. So I'm going to flip my work over. So again, I can keep all my excess to the left of my machine. You don't have to do this. It just makes it easier for me when I'm sewing on the machines to keep all the excess to my left. Switch my pins around. As long as these two edges are pinned, we're ready to go. Going to stitch through all layers, stitch through the pocket bag and the muslin. 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tack at the beginning. And it's going to be a little hard to tell where the end is. We can just stitch through the end there. I can see there's my muslin. Get down to that point and back tack at the end. Trim all of your threads. Make sure that uptake lever is up. Then you can lift your presser foot, remove your work, and trim both of your threads. There's my bobbin thread. So when I open this up, it should give a nice clean finish on the right side. I'll do the same on the back of my garment. 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tack at the beginning, back tack at the end. Uptake lever all the way up, lift your presser foot, remove your work, clip your threads on both ends. Okay. I'm going to go to the iron and press these seams flat. Here's my work. I'm going to press these flat. So if your positioning is correct, you should see your seam allowances fold back and make nice smooth finishes along the top and bottom edge of your pocket bag. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect, but back at the work table. Now I've got two pieces, two sides. My front with my shorter dart, my back with my longer dart, and you can see now we've added all this extra fabric in a contrasting fabric. I'm now going to take right sides. I've got the right side. I can no longer see my dart excess. I can't see my seam allowance. I'm going to place these right sides together and match up my side seam, my pocket bag, raw edges, all the way up. And then this descends down into the hip of either a skirt or a pair of pants, a pair of trousers. Do my best to line up the notches and the raw edges and pin this in place. Again, 1/2 inch seam allowance. If you need to, do your best to identify where these corners are. I'm going to do my best on my sewing machine to use my seam guides, so I know that I'm reaching a 1/2 inch. So when I pivot, I make sure I'm pivoting in the right place. I'm also going to mark my chalk a little bit more so it's a little easier to see. I want to make sure as I stitch over these seams that the seam allowances stay open, so I'm going to pin them open so they don't get caught under the machine or under the presser foot and start rolling in different directions. I'm going to do my best to align my pocket bag curves and pin those together. Line up my hip down here. I'm not going to pin too much in here because it's just going to get complicated up in there. It's a very sharp corner that we're turning. I don't want to stick too many pins in there. Okay, I'm going to head to my machine and I'll stitch at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the beginning, getting down here to my pivot point where my tailor's tack will be, pivoting and going around the edge of the pocket bag, all the way back up, still following a 1/2 inch seam allowance, making sure both of my seams stay open as I go. Come back up into my tailor's tack, pivot again, and come down my hip line. So it's one continuous seam all the way around. Back tack at the beginning. Get to my pivot where I can see my two chalk lines are meeting, lower my needle, lift my presser foot, pivot my work, and then continue the rest of my stitching. I think I can take one more stitch. As I pivot, I see that I'm not quite at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. There we go. Again, making sure my seams are still open underneath and on top of my work. I'm doing my best to follow the seam guides on my needle plate on my machine. Stay at 1/2 inch. Slowly work your way around this bottom curve. You may find your fabric trying to bunch up on you as you go around this bottom curve. If so, stop your work, lower your needle so it doesn't shift on you, raise your presser foot, pivot the fabric, let it loosen out, and slowly work your way around this curve. It can be very tight in here. I'm just going to take a few stitches, and if I see my fabric trying to bunch up on me, I'm going to stop my work, lower my needle, lift my foot, pivot. Again, coming to my next set of seams, I want to make sure those don't get unfurled. Make sure they're laying flat on the top and bottom. I'm going to work my way up into this next corner where my chalk marks are meeting. Lower my needle, lift my presser foot, pivot my work back around, and continue stitching. Back tack. Okay, I took 2 back tacks there. I wasn't quite on the edge. Make sure your take-up lever's all the way up. Lift your presser foot, remove your work. Clip all of your threads. Okay, so we stitched down the side seam, pivoted, went all the way around the pocket bag. I think my seam allowance got a little bit too wide, but it's just a sample. Pivoting again and coming back down what becomes our hip curve. I'm going to head over to the iron, and while I head over there, I'm going to grab my scissors on the way because I'm going to need those for the last set. Now at the iron, I'm going to open up my fabric, and you'll see that there's what might look like a seam to the untrained eye, but inside there is in fact a pocket inside of there. Now I want to find the front of my sample. My front has the shorter dart, my back has the longer dart. So this is the front of my work. When we make an inseam pocket, the pocket excess, the pocket bag, this piece here, goes towards the front. It lays to the front of the body because you don't want to try to put your pocket in and your pocket's going backwards around the butt. You want to keep your hands going towards the front of your body, so we push all the pocket bag excess towards the front of the body. So I'm going to, as you can see, here's the front of my sample with the shorter dart, and my pocket excess is going in that direction. I'm just going to flip everything around so I can see what's happening here. Here's the inside of my sample. Here's the front of my garment with the shorter dart, and all my pocket bag excess is going towards the front. Now, when we worked on the slash pocket, we had the the seam allowance was kind of going in 2 different directions. We just kind of pressed it down in 2 different directions. I'm going to give this a quick press. I'm going to grab my tailor's ham, because I am ironing on a curve here. So I'm going to place my curved side seam along my tailor's ham, making sure all my excess is going towards the front of my garment. And I'm going to press this with all my dart excess going towards the front of my sample, my front garment sample. So nice and crisp along that side seam there. If I turn this over, again, front of my sample with the shorter dart, I can see all my dart excess is going towards the front, as is my pocket bag. Now, when you're working with this, you can, if you're working on an actual garment that continues, you can shift your seam allowance with the iron, but I'm going to use my scissors to clip into my seam allowance. This is very important. This way I can press my seams open and I can press my pocket bag to one side. Up here at the top, you'll see I have 2 layers of seam allowance here. So I've got this one, which goes to the back of my garment, and I've got this one underneath that goes to the front of my garment. I'm going to lift up this first layer of seam allowance, the one that attaches to the back, and I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to snip into this corner, right where this fabric comes to a corner. And I know my tailor's tack is there. I know I've pivoted in that corner. I take my scissors and clip towards that corner, but I don't want to clip into my stitches. I should be about 1/16 of an inch away from where I stitched. It's hard to see because I have dark interfacing. That was a mistake on my part. My stitches come all the way down here and pivot. So this is where my stitches pivot, right here where my awl is. This is where I finished clipping. It's just 1/16 of an inch away. Just enough that I can open up this seam allowance and allow the rest of this seam allowance to go towards the front of my garment. I'm going to go ahead and press this section in place so that seam allowance will press open. So that's nice and flat at the top. It's going to make it easier to install a waistband or something. And down here at the bottom of my sample, I'll do the same thing. I've got 1 seam allowance on the top. Get my fingers in there. Got 1 seam allowance on the top that goes to the back of my sample, and another seam allowance that goes to the front of my sample. Just going to reach my scissors in between these 2 seam allowances, only cutting the seam allowance attached to the back of my garment. So my scissors are sliding in there. You can see this top seam allowance. The bottom seam allowance is down here, sitting underneath my needle, my scissors, so it's not cutting in. I'm not cutting the bottommost seam allowance. All this excess underneath here, I'm not even touching that with my scissors. Sliding right in between those 2 seam allowances. And I'm going to clip up into my corner, which is sitting right up here, just through this top layer seam allowance. Again, I'm only going to get about 1/8 of an inch, 1/4 of an inch into there. This is where I pivoted, like right in here, and this is where I stopped cutting. So I'm about 1/8 of an inch away. I can press this bottom seam allowance open, keep that nice and flat. So seam allowance nice and flat here and here, with the rest of the seam allowance and pocket bag going towards the front of the garment with the shorter dart. From the outside, this is what it would look like on the side of the body. You can slip your hand inside. There's that pocket bag. You can look inside and see the contrast fabric. Nice clean finished edges, no seams visible if you were working with a full-size garment. I'm going to remove my tailor's tacks. I don't need those anymore. If you find it a little bit difficult to get your tailor's tacks out, clip as close as you can to your sample. So those little threads kind of hide themselves inside. That is the advantage of keeping your tailor's tacks in is that you know exactly where you're sewing. They give you guidelines while you're sewing. Disadvantage is that they can be difficult to remove if they get caught in your sewing. So that takes care of our inseam pocket sample. You've got the nice curve of the side seam for either a pair of trousers or skirt. Again, you are not required to put the interfacing here, but if you have the interfacing, practice using it and cutting some little squares and placing those. I do recommend using a lighter interfacing so you can see your marks a little bit better. I've just used dark interfacing so you can clearly see it on my demo. Then we've got our stitching here. When you do seam finishes, when you're working with an actual garment, and if you decide to use this on your skirt, you'll serge or bias bind. You can't really do a turned and stitch seam finish on this. You can serge through this edge and then serge through all the layers as you go around and then back down. This is a very difficult pocket to clean finish, so keep that in mind when you're working on your skirts. Again, from the outside, this would be the front and the back with the longer dart in the back, and your pocket is accessible from the side seam.